Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. Today I want to talk a little bit about the concept of owning one's own shadow, which is a Jungian theory in psychology, and it has been written about a lot by Robert Johnson, and how it's about owning your own dark side, essentially, of your psyche. I want to talk to you guys about this book and how it relates to sci-fi stories and speculative fiction stories, such as Philip K. Dick's The Commuter, as well as The Rise of Skywalker and the concept of the Grey Jedi, and a bunch of other things. So, let's go ahead and start with defining what I even mean by this. If you guys have not heard of owning your own shadow or the concept of the shadow self, it is a theory by Carl Jung, which he further develops later on to have more of a nuanced meaning, but Robert Johnson uses the original meaning of being the darker side of your psyche. Your shadow self and your ego are like two different sides of a seesaw. And on the one hand, you have the ego, which is who the parts of you that you tend to embrace. It's not just who you are. The self is the whole seesaw. But the ego is the side you tend to embrace, and anything that you repress or reject immediately goes over into the shadow self, and it is on the other side of the seesaw. In the middle is the fulcrum of the seesaw, which is your true full self. And in order to embrace your full self, you have to reintegrate the dark parts as well as the parts that you consider to be the light to promote wholeness or unity. So in the case of this book, it's called Owning Your Own Shadow, Understanding the Dark Side of the Psyche by Robert A. Johnson. He goes in depth regarding how to reintegrate your own dark side and what that really means. In addition to the dark parts of yourself, your shadow can also have elements of gold, or the noble parts of ourselves that we tend to suppress. He further explains that that is why many people perform hero worship. They are reluctant to see these heroic or noble components of themselves within themselves, so they repress them and instead admire them in other people. Similarly, with the dark sides of ourself and our shadow, we will project those onto other people. So when we get annoyed by someone else being a certain type of way, it is often because that is how we are inside in a certain aspect, and we've been repressing it instead of embracing it. So we like and dislike the things in other people that are parts of ourselves that we aren't really embracing. To that end, he says that we have to unite them to achieve wholeness or unity. And in that regard, he also likens it to two overlapping circles. So think of a Venn diagram. And in the middle of the overlapping circles is that little almond-shaped part, which he refers to as a mandorla. The word mandorla comes from the word for almond in Italian, and it just means that little almond-shaped piece in the middle. And his goal is to broaden our mandorlas by embracing both sides, and then we will achieve wholeness. He also describes the etiology of the word religion to actually come from the Latin ligare, which is also where the term ligature comes from. It means to bind together. So religion means to bind back together, to make whole again, essentially. And that is what he is aiming for when he speaks of religion. So, to that end, what does that really mean for sci-fi? Well, in sci-fi, we see this theme a lot. I recently watched Philip K. Dick's Electric Dreams, and in one of the episodes, The Commuter, a local employee at a city transit center, so this guy just works at the light rail, is alarmed to discover that some people who take this train each day are going to a town that shouldn't exist. It's not on any of the stops, it's not on his list, and it's not actually stopping because the train isn't running longer in time to account for that. So he's very confused as to what's happening, and every time he goes to question someone about it, that person just kind of disappears, but it's while his back is turned, so he's not sure how they're just leaving. So this guy decides he's going to ride the train and find out what's going on. He gets on the train, starts his timer, and sits there observing how long it's taking the train to run and where the stops are. And what he finds is that the train is not stopping at a new city. Instead, it just keeps going, and people are jumping off of the train, tuck and roll, and going to work. People are wearing heels, though, for part of this, I think, and that was a little weird for me as a woman. I'm like, I'm not jumping off of a train wearing heels. I'm not trying to get a broken ankle, but I digress. So they jump off into this field, and he follows them, and they walk through the field and up over this hill, and when they get to the other side, there's just this really cute little town in there. And he checks it out, and everyone there seems so happy. And that's such a stark contrast from his regular life, which is rather dreary. He's having difficulties with his marriage, even though he and his wife do love each other very much. And their son, who is somewhere between 17 and 21 probably. He looks pretty young, but he's a young man. And he has a lot of trouble in his personal life. He's very difficult. So this is kind of a reprieve for our main character. So our main character experiences this, and everything's super nice, and then he goes home, and his son doesn't exist anymore. It's like he and his wife never even had a kid. They tried, but they weren't able to have one. And so he goes back the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and each time he goes back, everything happens very similarly to how it did his first trip, but he gradually forgets more and more of his troubles and becomes happier over time. Finally, he is faced with the truth via this video screen, and it shows him all of the dark pieces of himself that he is leaving behind by continuing to go to this addictive, positive place. And when he discovers this, he sits down and talks to the woman who essentially created this place. And she says that most people decide to stay. They don't ever want to go back to their former lives. But him being torn about that, because he now realizes he has a son that he had no idea about because of the brainwashing, that he is considering wanting his son back. And it's messing up the balance of the place. And the place starts to get dark because he is a dark smudge, essentially, on the entire, the psyche, I would say, of this little place. So he has a long talk with this lady, and he goes home and he thinks about it, and he asks his wife, he's like, how did we meet? And she's like, are you okay? But just talks through all of it with him because he was starting to forget those things too. And he goes back to that lady and he decides that he wants those pieces back. And she's like, it's going to make you more miserable. I can tell you that with certainty, that in the long run, even though you do love your son, that his life is only going to get harder and more miserable, and it is going to affect you and your wife negatively. It's also going to make you both miserable. And the man ends up deciding he doesn't care, that it's important to embrace the dark components of our life as well, and that we can't just run from it. We can't just go towards escapism. And indeed, I have read some articles in psychology that say that escapism is the least healthy form of coping. It's the least healthy coping mechanism. Now, I am guilty of that just like a lot of people are with sci-fi. I love sci-fi because it is partly, an escape from everything that's going on today. And even when it's not a total escape, it's a reprieve. So sci-fi allows us to sit back and view socio-political and socio-cultural issues from more of a detached lens because we're watching it play out amongst aliens and in metaphors. Like when Dr. Crusher is dating that Trill guy and he ends up needing to have the symbiont rather has to get a new Trill body. And when he obtains the new Trill body, then that person is female. And Dr. Crusher cannot get past the fact that it is not the same bodily representation of the person she fell in love with, even though the personality is the same, because she fell in love with the personality of the symbiont, not necessarily of the Trill himself. This is before Jadzia existed, so they further fleshed that out a little bit differently later on, but in this early form of the Trill, really they were using it as an allegory for transgender issues and how Dr. Crusher loved this person but could not get past her own biases in order to embrace them. And that happens in modern society today where people date transgender individuals and then they just can't handle it when that person transitions. And it's very sad. But it allows us through sci-fi to view it in a detached manner, and that allows us to remove ourselves from the situation far enough that the proximity is no longer blinding and we can fully understand it in a different way. And that's what I mean when I say it gives me a reprieve, even when it is still talking about socio-political issues. We're going to go on a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about how this theme is echoed in The Rise of Skywalker.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about the concept of owning your own shadow, what that really means in the Jungian context, and as Robert Johnson uses it, as well as its place in Philip K. Dick's The Commuter. Now we're going to talk a little bit about The Rise of Skywalker. If you've not seen this movie yet, I waited a month to talk about it, so skip ahead 10 minutes or so, and we'll be on another topic. 5, 4, 3, 2. All right. Now that everyone has been able to skip ahead, we're going to go ahead and dig into The Rise of Skywalker. So, I don't know about you guys, but I was very much hoping for a Grey Jedi story, and I am so glad that we got it. I am thrilled that Rey is able to use, the Force powers that are considered to be more Sith-aligned, like, using Force lightning. She used it and blew up a whole ship. That was pretty BA. But overall, though, I was just very excited for that. I was not excited when I thought Chewie was on the ship, but other than that, I was like, yes, this is what I am here for, is Rey using Force lightning. I've been wanting a Grey Jedi story for a long time. If you are not as into the Star Wars universe as you are into other types of sci-fi and speculative fiction, a Grey Jedi is one who can use both dark and light side powers. So in that regard, Yoda is considered to be a Jedi. He is on the light side. Darth Vader is considered to be the dark side. And they are always encouraged, Siths are encouraged to go fully dark, Jedi fully light. The Jedi will abstain from a lot of emotional connections, even the ones that we would consider to be light or positive, because they believe that emotional attachment of any type can lead to grief or lead to anger or sadness, and those, they think, lead to the dark side. Whereas the dark side is like, you can't love anybody because you have to be fully dark. We want you super dark, so that you're willing to put yourself and your Sith Lord Master above all others. That's the only thing that they really care about. So, in that regard, anyone in between is considered to be a Grey Jedi, but you don't really get to see them in the previous movies. Grey Jedi are not a thing in the movies. They are in the extended universe if you're interested in reading those and in the lore. It's a lot of fun. And in this context, you have, good versus evil and then a balance. So the whole point of a lot of these Star Wars stories is they keep talking about the one who will bring balance to the Force. But it's not really balance. And that's because the Jedi keep trying to wipe out the Sith Lords. The Sith keep trying to dominate the galaxy. But the Sith don't really care about balance. Only the Jedi do. But it doesn't always make sense how they approach it. At one point, Obi-Wan says, only a Sith deals in absolutes. Which is funny because that is an absolute in and of itself. So, they're kind of misguided in a couple ways. And we see that as we go along, that they are trying to do what they think is right, but they're kind of missing the point along the way. You cannot have balance if you have only Jedi. That's not balance. That's just light side. So, as we go, they're trying to find balance, and they think that Anakin is the one, and then they think that Luke is the one. And I've read that the last movie was actually supposed to be about Leia becoming the one, but since Carrie Fisher passed away, they made it about Rey. And I'm okay with that. They did what they needed to do, and I enjoyed the story. I didn't really care for the first two as much, but I really liked what they did with The Rise of Skywalker. So, in The Rise of Skywalker, Rey is able to use Force powers from the dark side and the light side, and it's because her heritage is from Palpatine, which is not good. It's less than ideal. We'll say it that way. It's less than ideal for her, but that means she has both the dark and the light in her, much like Ben does as well, and much like Yoda said, much of your father I sense in you, when he was talking to Luke. And they were not jazzed about them having this darkness in them. And indeed, when Luke went to deal with Ben being prone to darkness, he went too far in trying to get the darkness out of him, and the darkness essentially popped up in Luke himself. And then he sequesters himself as a hermit on this island after everyone else is dead and are gone. And that's why he's like, the time of the Jedi must end. At least in my opinion, that's how I interpreted it. Because it's not healthy at that point. Luke realizes that his blind dedication to the light is largely what drove Ben to the dark side. It was a large betrayal on the part of Luke against Ben. Ben hadn't done anything at that point. He was just prone to fits of anger, but he's a teenage boy. He has hormones. I'm sure hormones exist in the Star Wars universe, even though we don't really talk about them. But, he had a lot of his own father and his own mother in him. Leia is hot-headed. So is Han. Wow, the two of them together are very hot-headed. So I understand that Ben is, very prone to emotional outbursts, but that's also why the Jedi needed to end, because it was kind of like toxic positivity. We can't be positive all of the time. That's not healthy. It doesn't allow us to sit in grief and really experience it. And that type of emotional repression or suppression at that point is not healthy. So Rey, though, gets to embrace both. And we see Ben embrace both for a little bit there at the end. He's willing to do stuff by any means necessary to get rid of Palpatine at that point. He still has the Sith in him of, I'm going to do what's good for me at any cost. But for him, it's not loyalty to his master, which is not surprising. Siths also turn on each other a lot. But he really feels drawn to Rey. And so he's going to do whatever he needs to do for Rey and himself. And that means doing dark things or light things, whatever means necessary. And Rey ends up making a similar choice with Palpatine. She is going to use whatever means necessary to destroy him. Force lightning? Cool. She'll do it. She doesn't care about that. It's not really about a redemption arc for Ben, although I did enjoy the redemption arc aspect of it. It is about Rey changing the paradigm of what a Sith versus a Jedi is supposed to look like, what a Force user is supposed to look like. And at the end of the day, she takes the ego part of herself and all the light side, and then all of the shadow portion of herself, her desperation, her impulses, looking for her family and really investing in all that, and her fear of turning out to be like Palpatine when she finds out that that is one of her ancestors. She takes all of those emotions and those different feelings that the Jedi would tell you otherwise to repress, and she harnesses it instead to perform good. Now, it reminds me a lot of Mace Windu. I felt that Mace Windu was pretty close to a gray Jedi as far as all the other Jedi before have been in the actual movie universe. But I was very excited to see Rey go that route, and I'm glad that her lightsaber was yellow. That really made me feel more in tune with the gray Jedi concept, because the blue and green versus red was very much like a hot and cold dichotomy, or fire and earth kind of dichotomy, fire and water. It's very much binary opposition in visual format, and I enjoyed that she went with a neutral color. It's not a combination of both of them, like Mace Windu's was purple. Hers is yellow. It is gender neutral. It is neutral in every other aspect except for Roy G. Biv. So in the color spectrum, if it were the Green Lantern universe, she would have just been a little bit on the dark side, I suppose, of being a yellow lantern. But other than that, for the most part, it's very much a neutral choice. And that is what she ends up being, is true neutral by the end of it. She is a gray Jedi. And for her, that is her mandorla, that almond shape that's in the middle of the Venn diagram, and all of it overlapping so that she finds herself one with herself and also with the Force. She is whole, she is unified, and there is balance. We're going to go on another break. When we come back, we're going to talk about how people can be more than one thing.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Rise of Skywalker. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the Santa Clarita Diet and that same concept. If you guys have not seen the Santa Clarita Diet, I really enjoy the show. It is about a woman who gets turned into a zombie on the very first episode, like in the first 20 minutes, and how she and her family kind of cope with it. Because she's not a mindless zombie, she just has a taste for flesh. In the Santa Clarita Diet universe, being zombified means that you have all of your traits of who you are magnified. Your goodness, your hunger, your anger, your sex drive, all of it is entirely magnified. So Sheila, in this case, is the zombie, but she's also a mom to like a 14, 15-year-old girl. I think that's about the age that Abby is. And her husband, Joel, loves her very much. But their sex life had been kind of lackluster. And so her getting zombified has turned into a strange gift as well as a curse. So we have a strong theme in here of light and dark emerging and being reintegrated as Sheila works her way through guilt and feeling upset by this and how it's impacting her husband and her daughter, to Sheila really embracing her full self, the parts that she was repressing before she was a zombie, the parts that she was afraid to express, good or bad, the gold in her shadow along with the dark. And she starts becoming more active at work. She's crushing it on all of her goals. And when one coworker, played by Nathan Fillion, steps up to her and decides he's going to assault her, and via blackmail, because coercion is a form of assault, and he goes to assault her in her own backyard, and she bites his finger off and then kills him and eats him. This is before she realizes that if you're a zombie and you bite somebody, they can come back. So they dig him up and take him back to their house and keep him in their garage, essentially, for a little bit, or their basement, I believe. And at one point, they really start liking him. His name is Gary. And as a disembodied head, Gary's not so bad. But Joel, it takes a little bit longer to come around to him. Sheila has more sympathy for him because she is further on her path of embracing her full self, including the dark parts, than Joel is. Everyone is on their own paths for this, and they're at different points on the paths. So since Sheila is working towards embracing her full self and reintegrating the dark with the light, or the shadow with the ego, she's, kind of sympathetic towards Gary. And she's like, hey, I feel really bad about turning you into a zombie. I didn't mean to do that. I didn't know it would do that. And I'm sorry I left you buried in the desert for so long before I figured it out. What can I do to help make that up to you? And Gary's like, okay, I have a niece named Kayla, and she lives hours and hours away from here and has a daughter. She is a single mom, and I have been taking care of her financially for the last several years. I would like for you guys to make sure that she gets the title to my house and any money that I had left, in order to make sure that she and the kid are okay. That's the only thing I really care about at this point. And Joel is kind of flabbergasted at this point and is like, dude, you tried to assault my wife. And Gary goes, people can be more than one thing, Joel. And that has really stuck with me since the very first time I watched that show. And whenever someone says something to me that indicates I'm being contradictory or that someone else is being contradictory, I just go, hey, people can be more than one thing, Joel. And most of my friends haven't seen the show, so they are very confused up until I explain it to them, and then they're like, God, you and Sci-Fi again? But, whatever. They'll deal with it. That's part of who I am, and they can decide whether that's in my shadow or my ego. I like to think it's in my ego. But in this way, we can see that Gary is probably further on the seesaw on the dark side of it. He's much more comfortable with his shadow, but he also has some good components as well. Now, I hesitate to label it as a good trait because Robert Johnson, in that book, Owning Your Own Shadow, Understanding the Dark Side of the Psyche, says that there is no inherent good or bad value that can be placed on a trait. Where it comes from, good or bad, is the value that we place on it and how we utilize it. So, for example, gluttony, which is what Sheila is going through with these zombies and her zombie impulses to eat people, and greed are both about self-preservation. And those are very animalistic instincts. It is culture that tells us that these are bad. However, Robert Johnson says we just need to find a way to reintegrate that into our lives. Reintegration does not necessarily mean that we have to express it. You don't have to just willy-nilly express greed, not in a way that would harm people anyway. And there's another way to think of that. So since greed is just an expression of self-preservation, we ask ourselves, how can we do this in a way that would not harm other people while still preserving ourselves? So, utilizing the stock market may be one way that you could do that, where you are amassing more resources for yourself without necessarily harming other people. Whereas if you are running a company and you're not really caring about your employees, and so you are making a whole bunch of money and they don't really have a living wage, that would be a negative expression of that. You want to integrate it without harming others. That's what Robert Johnson is getting at. And similarly, in the Santa Clarita Diet, at one point they decide, hey, if Sheila needs to eat people, we're going to make sure that she only eats bad people, which is also very similar to Dexter. Although Dexter's, I understand, is a psychological thriller, so it doesn't really fall into the purview of speculative fiction. But it's very similar in concept to where it's like, okay, I feel these dark impulses from my shadow self, and instead of repressing them and causing further problems in my shadow self and allowing it to manifest in lashing out in anger, instead I'm going to harness that. I'm going to reintegrate it with myself, and they decide that they will only kill bad people. They find a softball team that is strictly by Nazis, white nationalists in general, and they decide they're going to kill and eat all of these Nazis. And that is how Sheila kind of reintegrates her shadow self with her ego and really embraces the fullness of who she is without really harming other good people per se. She's still harming other people because she's eating people, but they're Nazis. So in that way, she feels this is a safe expression, and it allows her mandorla, that almond shape in the middle, to more fully overlap until she is whole and one with herself. We're going to go on a break. When we come back, we're going to continue talking about that theme in the Santa Clarita Diet.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back. In our last segment, we started talking about the themes of owning your own shadow in the Santa Clarita Diet, and specifically how that impacts Sheila and Gary. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the other characters. In this story, we also have Joel, the husband, Abby, the daughter, and their next door neighbor. The kid next door is named Eric, and Eric is considered to be very strange by everyone around him because he's very much into the occult. But that also means that when Abby's mom gets turned into a zombie, that she knows someone that she can talk to. The mom and dad have no idea. They are kind of boring real estate agents before the mom gets turned into a zombie. But Abby's like, hey, I know a guy. And she drags Eric into their messy lives. But Eric loves it. So when Eric gets involved, they start getting some more answers, and they know which questions to ask in order to get the right answers. So Eric is super helpful in this way, but he's also very insecure. Insecurity kind of rules his shadow self because his father is not around, and he instead has a terrible stepdad who is just super mean and demeaning to Eric all the time because his stepdad is very much into just more macho stuff and thinks that Eric being into sci-fi and speculative fiction is dumb. He doesn't like it. And so he treats Eric really badly because it's a classic jock nerd dichotomy or geek dichotomy. Both in Eric's case, I think, because he's also like a straight A student. So in this case, Eric starts hero worshiping Joel. And that's the gold in Eric's shadow that he's reluctant to embrace in himself. He likes how masculine Joel is while also being able to talk about his feelings. Joel is more of like a happy medium between Eric and his stepdad Dan because Joel is emotionally present for his daughter and for his wife and also often for Eric. So Eric starts looking up to Joel quite a bit. And over time, they develop this really wholesome masculine friendship. I absolutely love their friendship in the series. Sometimes Joel's like, hey, that's too far. That's too far, Eric. But it's helping Eric figure out who he is and embrace his whole self through hero worshiping Joel. So in the book, Robert Johnson says that today's hero is tomorrow's character. And he gives an example of a 14-year-old boy who idolizes a 16-year-old. So, at 14, you don't have a license or anything yet. You don't feel that cool. Your voice is dropping if you're male, and your secondary sex characteristics are really coming in full force. You like facial hair, all that jazz, hair all over your body. And it can be an awkward time in a teenager's life. Junior high can be rough. So in this case, Eric is going through all of that as well. Joel is already past that point in his life and is a full adult. So Eric is idolizing him, much like a 14-year-old would a 16-year-old who has already been through all that. They're starting to look more masculine. They may have a car as well. And it's just someone that they can look up to. So in this case, it's Eric and Joel. But in this example with the 14-year-old and the 16-year-old, Robert Johnson says that after a while, when the 14-year-old becomes more like that 16-year-old, then they're going to start, really idolizing like an 18-year-old who's able to do things like buy cigarettes and stuff like that. So as time goes by, the people that we are hero worshiping or that we're idolizing often become who we are on the inside as we emulate them, and it kind of shapes our character. And in this case, with Eric and Joel, Eric really likes Joel and appreciates him and finds a way to be expressive of both the traits that he believes are masculine in himself that he's been repressing and is admired in Joel, but also still expressing the feminine traits that he is more comfortable with. Now, I'm not saying that being emotionally present is inherently a feminine kind of thing. I just mean in the Western cultural context, it is considered to be more feminine. So Eric is getting used to not being ridiculed for just liking the things that he likes and for being emotionally present and considerate of other people's feelings. Dan had not modeled that for him with Eric's mom. And so this is a new experience for him with Joel. So he's found his new idol. And as time goes by, Eric learns how to step up and, be fully present for the people in his life and to let go of some of that fear and insecurity by having these experiences with Joel and with Abby, who tends to embrace more masculine aspects of herself rather than feminine ones, as she's also a teenager and she's going through this in her personal life. She has a lot going on at home. She has a lot going on with school. But she and Eric also tend to grow together, while Abby is also learning to embrace her parents as they are and learning how to really be her full self through her relationships with these other people. They don't necessarily address shadow work in and of itself in the show, but I found that after I read this book by Robert Johnson, that the themes really popped out at me. As I went along reading, I'm like, oh yeah, that is the Commuter. I just watched that. That is The Rise of Skywalker. That is Santa Clarita Diet. There are so many aspects of sci-fi and speculative fiction in general that derive from this book. I don't think that they were based on it per se, but they definitely correlate, and it's very interesting to see that. But I think that part of that is because of the hero's journey type of trope, and how, that is about someone coming into their own. And in the case of the book, coming into your own means embracing your full self, including the dark parts. All right, we're going to go on another quick break. See you in a minute.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about the sense of shadow in the different characters in Santa Clarita Diet. Now I want to talk a little bit more about this book and other elements of sci-fi and speculative fiction. So there's an example in the book in which he describes how a friend went to her hour of therapy with a doctor in Zurich who was famous for only commenting with the single word "ja" to anything he was told. So his friend went out and explained the complexity of her life and the problems she was experiencing to this therapist. And then she burst into tears and said that she could no longer stand it. And the doctor replied, "Yeah, good. Now something will happen." And this is a very strong concept in Jungian psychology. And Robert Johnson refers to it as stark medicine, but it is correct for one who has the strength to bear it. It's very similar to that old song, "Something's Gotta Give." When an unstoppable force meets an immovable object, that is where we're going to find true growth and change, which he refers to as the religious experience, because remember, it means to bind back together. This is also something that Jung has talked about before, and he said to find out what a person fears most, and that is where he will develop next, because the ego is fashioned like metal between the hammer and the anvil. They also purport that heroism could be redefined for our time as the ability to stand a paradox. So what they really mean is that when you're considering these two different truths or two different traits that are in front of you, you may view them as being opposite, but you can reconcile them together and hold both at the same time. Remember, people can be more than one thing, Joel. So, in that regard, if we think about the rise of Skywalker and how heroism is really redefined in that time as Rey being a gray Jedi, she is standing firmly in both parts of her truth on that seesaw. She's standing right over the fulcrum, but she has one foot on either side of it, truly balancing her dark side and her light side by fully experiencing and reintegrating both. Similarly, Sheila is following that path. I really love a good anti-hero or a good, like, gray Jedi type hero. I'm sure you guys can tell that from a lot of the choices that I select to talk about on here. But it just gives us a really nuanced look at humanity. And that's one thing I really enjoy about speculative fiction. Similarly, in Frankenstein, we know that the monster is not truly a monster at all, even though that's what he is labeled as. He is merely misunderstood, and he's a product of his environment and of his creation. So he's a product of his enculturation, what he was born into, and his acculturation, the experiences that he has along the way. And we feel sad and sympathetic at some points for the monster because he's not truly meaning to necessarily do all of this harm. He just is not able to unite the two parts of himself, his shadow and his ego, in order to be truly whole and healthy. In truth, Dr. Frankenstein is the monster. There's another component of this concept in mindfulness. So if you haven't heard of mindfulness, it is a concept where you just recognize your emotions and the things going on around you as they are and just let them exist, and they say pass through you without judgment. So you're not judging yourself for your dark impulses. Ray's not judging herself for her dark impulses, neither is Sheila. They are just letting them be what they are and recognizing that that's part of them and then choosing what to do from there. An early issue of Psychology Today had on its cover, "Don't just do something, stand there." I didn't say that backwards. That is indeed what it said. And it is largely about mindfulness. You're not going to just act without thinking. You need to really mindfully process what's going on in order to address these paradoxes. Paradox is brought to its next stage of development by a highly conscious waiting, is what Robert Johnson says. That means that we really need to observe why we're feeling the way we're feeling and really integrate that into our person. And that's what Ray does. That's what Sheila does. They're like, okay, why am I doing this the way that I'm doing it? Just because I've been doing it this way doesn't mean that it's right. Just because it's tradition does not mean we need to keep following it. That is why Yoda sets that tree on fire. He realizes that that is not the way that things need to be. Whereas Luke at that point is still mad and he hasn't come to that same conclusion quite yet. He's just like, no, it's time for the Jedi to end. And he's just mad about it because he is feeding into the dark component of himself and his shadow where he feels like a failure and he feels insecure. Because like Uncle Ben said, with great power comes great responsibility. And the responsibility of what happened with Ben, Luke also feels is his fault. It is both his fault and his responsibility. And in that way, Luke he feels like a failure. And it's really gotten to him on a fundamental level. And he's identifying more of that shadow self with himself than the good things. Whereas Yoda's already one with the Force at that point, and he can see things more clearly at that point. Where he's like, yeah, the Jedi do need to end. But not, really in the way you think. And also, she already took the books, so I'm just symbolically setting this on fire to teach you a lesson from beyond the grave. I love Yoda. He is such a messy bee who lives for the drama. Although, I would really say that most Star Wars characters are. Luke is not as messy, but he is pretty messy. Darth Vader, he is a messy, messy queen who lives for the drama. I love it. And so is Emperor Palpatine. Like, he's just cackling. At the end of every Star Wars trilogy now, we have Palpatine just cackling and zapping people and just reveling in it. He is, like, way out there. But it's also interesting to me that he derives such joy from these dark components of himself. So Palpatine isn't just staying mad all the time. He is embracing parts of himself that we would consider to be light. He still experiences joy. It's usually just at the expense of others. And in that way, I think it really illustrates how traits are not inherently good or evil. They rather have the meaning that we assign to them culturally. So Palpatine does experience joy. but is joy at the expense of others, especially when it comes from inflicting pain on another, truly good? No. So joy is not inherently good. It is just the meaning we tend to assign to it, and we tend to put it on the ego side of the seesaw instead of on the shadow side. But really, it is neither good nor evil. We're going to go on another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about how this really impacted Anakin Skywalker.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. In our last segment, we were talking about owning our own shadow and how that manifests in different ways with different characters in Star Wars. Now we're going to talk specifically about Anakin Skywalker. So with Anakin, he had a very difficult path to walk. Anakin was formed from midichlorians, and so he did not have anyone to really model truly healthy behavior beyond just his mother. And that's not just because he did not have a father around, but also because Anakin grew up as a slave. So the people who were treating his mother a certain type of way, the behavior he saw modeled was not healthy behavior. Watto was very unkind to Shmi, and Anakin loved her no matter what, and Shmi had a kind, quiet heart. So she was also modeling that for him. But when he was taken away from that place and he had to leave his mother behind, that was really rough for Anakin because the Jedi forbid attachment. And so as Anakin continues on his journey, he is always plagued by guilt about how his mother is still a slave at this point and he is living this different life. If any of you have ever left a place in your life that was difficult and you had to leave people that you loved behind, particularly if it was in some type of abusive case, then you may understand where Anakin's guilt is coming from at this point. I once saw an Instagram post by Will Smith that said that there's a difference between fault and responsibility, and that really stuck with me. And he says just because something is not your fault does not mean that it's not your responsibility. So when someone hurts you, that's on them. That was their fault. But unfortunately, they're not going to be the ones responsible for rebuilding in you what they broke. That is your responsibility. Similarly, with Anakin, he having to leave his mom behind was not his fault. He was a child. But he feels this burden of responsibility, although in his case, it is very much misplaced. It is not really Anakin's responsibility to care for Shmi, but by the time he is able to really go back for her and goes against orders of attachment to really find his mom and care for her, it is too late. And so he has this burden of guilt he carries not only for leaving her, but also for her dying. And he's feeling a heavy weight of responsibility throughout the rest of his life. That is very difficult for him because he is just told by the Jedi to continue repressing it. But remember, when you repress something, even the good parts of yourself, it goes into your shadow. So Anakin is not wrong for caring about his mom. But because the Jedi do not allow positive, healthy expression of traits that they consider to be negative, it causes his shadow to continue growing. which I think is an incredibly apt description of considering that point in the movie when Jake Lloyd's Anakin is walking away from the houses on Tatooine and you kind of see the shadow of Darth Vader on the wall behind him. I had that poster on my bedroom wall when I was a little kid, and I absolutely love the symbolism in it. And it's really about how his shadow is going to continue to grow and loom over Anakin until his seesaw really unbalances and he loses it. In the book, Owning Your Own Shadow, Robert Johnson refers to this sense of getting totally unbalanced and flipping to the other side as being an unhealthy expression of the other, but also that your seesaw can completely break if it is too heavily loaded. And in Anakin's case, it does get too heavily loaded, and it leads to a psychosis or a breakdown. And that is from the book, but also exactly what happens to Anakin. He is also manipulated by Sheev Palpatine, but Anakin really just gets so far with his burdens that he is unable to really carry them anymore, and he snaps, and he kills the younglings. He follows these crazy orders and flips to the opposite of who he was as that kind boy we first met in episode 1. And that's just because he was not allowed to try to reintegrate his shadow into who he was. Some people's shadows are going to be heavier than others. Robert Johnson says that we all culturally carry one, but that when our parents lay their shadows on us, or when others of any type lay their shadows on us or project them onto us, then it can cause a lot of damage. He mostly speaks to this disproportionate damage in the concept of parents and children, and says, he refers to a portion of the Bible that says that the sins of the father will be visited onto the son for 3 to 4 generations, and that's just about how we pass down generations of cyclical violence, which is also what happens in Star Wars. We think about Anakin and how he is treated by Watto and how he's treated by everyone around him, where when he does get heroes, these heroes tell him to repress his emotions. And as we mentioned earlier, the heroes of today are your character of tomorrow. So he keeps stuffing it down, but he is running out of space in his container to hold all of that anymore until he eventually loses it. Similarly, Luke absolutely almost loses it on Ben. He's ready to kill his nephew because he is afraid himself that Ben is going to go too far. Luke did not fully embrace his shadow. We know that Luke is a fearful person because of how we see him in the cave and how he is afraid he's going to turn into his father, Darth Vader. And that very similarly continues on through his life. Luke never really deals with that fear entirely. And so when it raises its head, because he has not integrated that fear and that part of him into his full self, and he's relegated it to the shadow, when he does experience it again, he almost acts impulsively and kills his nephew in cold blood just to prevent something that might possibly happen. That's insecurity. That's him not feeling like he is a good enough Jedi Master in order to really harness in what is going on with Ben. He does not believe enough in himself to be able to help him dial that back. And so he lets that fear reign. And that is really difficult for us to see in Luke, but it makes sense. I didn't really like the fact that he was hermiting on that planet when I first started watching the new trilogy. But when I look at it through the lens of the shadow and the ego, I'm like, okay, that really makes sense. Luke's ego was telling him, he is a Jedi like his father before him, and he's going to be, the best Jedi ever. He's going to bring balance to the Force, but he still deep down feels like that farm boy, and he's not good enough to guide these kids. And when he lets his shadow overrule the rest of him, he causes these deep problems. And I think that is also really interesting if we think about Han and Leia and how Han probably doesn't think that he can be that great of a dad. Han didn't have a good upbringing. We get to see some of that in Solo, a Star Wars story. But also, if you like the Extended Universe books, in those books, he grew up on a ship as part of a grifting team of orphans ran by this guy, and who was not nice to the orphans. And in this situation, he has not had good heroes. Heroes of today is the character of tomorrow. So Han later on does get these solid heroes, even in the presence of his friends, in the form of his friends. And he's able to kind of change how he is. But he doesn't continue that shadow work for whatever reason. We don't really see what went on between him and Leia after that point, between them, you know, the end of Jedi really, before Ben's even born, and the point where Ben is living with Luke and then losing it. I don't know how Han or Leia felt about sending their kid to go and train with their uncle in this Jedi Order. I think it's very interesting because Leia did not end up fully pursuing becoming a Jedi herself in this timeline that we see in The Rise of Skywalker, but she still sent her child over there because she knew that if she continued down that path, that it would result in Ben's death. So she was trying to avoid harming him. But in the end, because she was unable to integrate that fear herself into her own shadow, it still ended up being a problem later on. And as Yoda says, always in motion is the future. You don't actually know which eventuality you're going to come to until it actually gets there. So Leia really only saw possible futures if we are adhering to what Yoda has said before. And that really is problematic for me. I feel like she should have maybe known a little bit better in that aspect. But again, Leia wasn't fully trained, and that's not necessarily her fault. It's just her responsibility. Perhaps from her perspective, and maybe Han's as well, because she probably shared what she had seen with her partner, it was better to back off herself and to send her son over to her brother than to keep him at home and possibly him end up being harmed, or for her to continue her training and for him to be harmed. But since the Jedi do teach detachment, that could have been very problematic for such an emotional kid who also likely did not grow up, you know, in the old style youngling way. But we don't actually know that. Perhaps Ben was with Luke the entire time and was deprived of having a lot of time with his parents, although we could tell that he loved them both very much, although it was buried deep down underneath all of his pain and his anger and possibly any guilt that he had towards his father's death at his hands as well. All right, guys, that's about all I have for you today. I hope that you've enjoyed looking at some of our favorite speculative fiction through the lens of owning your own shadow, understanding the dark side of the psyche, and how hero worship can be just as problematic and a part of their shadow as, you know, the really truly dark components, but how the dark components can be redeemed by just accepting them as they are and reintegrating them with ourselves. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly. Have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.